Grounded is a survival game that shrinks players down to the size of ants and drops them into a suburban backyard filled with danger and discovery. It's been out for quite a while with an official release in 2022, but I had somehow missed it. This ended up being a good thing because it enabled me to play it in its final form with all the possible content released. The game aims to blend survival mechanics with an adventurous exploration of a micro-sized world while offering a refreshing take on the survival genre with its innovative concept. This may sound strange, but if I had to compare it to another survival game, I'd probably pick Conan Exiles. In case you have missed my review of that game, I suggest you catch up by watching it, provided that you are over 18 and have verified it with YouTube, since the game has some mature aspects and had to be marked for people over 18 just to be safe. Anyway, before I dive deep into the review of Grounded, I have to address its ultra-wide support. In short, yes, it supports it, but if you want to play it in 32:9 like I do, the field of view slider just isn't covering enough. So you will have to edit one of the game's configuration files and manually enter a higher value. This is, for all intents and purposes, as minimal of a modification as possible, but it is still something that was not done properly, so I have to address it. If you're playing in 21:9, the in-game setting is good enough for you though. One of Grounded's strongest features is its creative premise. Set in a backyard where the mundane becomes monumental, Grounded's world design is impressively imaginative. Common backyard objects like grass, rocks, and soda cans become towering structures, while bugs like ants, spiders, and ladybugs transform into terrifying, larger-than-life creatures. The game effectively taps into the classic Honey, I Shrunk the Kids fantasy, allowing players to explore what is normally familiar from a now radically different perspective. And explore you shall, since the devs have packed the map with tons of things to discover and a lot of materials to gather. The atmosphere of the game is often filled with tension. The size disparity between the player and the insect world creates a constant feeling of vulnerability during the first 20 to 30 hours of the game, and the survival mechanics such as crafting tools, building shelters, and managing hunger and thirst force players to think carefully about every action. The game's environment, both dangerous and beautiful, creates a sense of awe that fuels exploration and encourages players to delve deeper into its intricately crafted world. One thing that struck me was how many different insects there are. Enemy variety is definitely something I value, and Grounded delivers it big time. In addition to that, it combines exploration, crafting, and combat mechanics in a way that are both familiar and fresh. The core survival loop, gather resources, build, craft, and fight, works well within the shrunken down world. Crafting tools from bug parts, building bases using blades of grass, and making armor from acorn shells adds a distinctive flavor to the genre. The building mechanics, though somewhat simplistic compared to games like Conan Exiles, offer enough depths to be satisfying. Combat, however, can be a point of frustration. While early game enemies like ants and aphids are relatively easy to manage, larger creatures like spiders are overwhelming. Now don't get me wrong, this is a survival game and it's quite natural for it to be way harder at the beginning while you're still getting a feel for things. The challenge is part of the fun, but at times the difficulty spike feels too steep, and I imagine this would be even more so if you play alone. The game seems to encourage cooperative multiplayer, as taking down the larger creatures can feel unfairly difficult for single players. Even though creature HP scales with the amount of players on the server, having multiple partners working together with you still seems to be much easier. Luckily, there are ways to cheese most enemies in the game, making the encounters trivial. The community of Grounded players seems to generally frown upon this, but my personal roleplay allows for such a strategy, since I imagine myself as an intellectually superior human being who is fighting and outsmarting bugs. Nevertheless, when it comes to the game's combat system, there is but one core mechanic you need to master, and it is called perfect blocking. It's something that you've probably seen in other games, only there it was most likely called parrying. Essentially, blocking the last moment before an enemy attack connects makes you take no damage. If you manage to do this several times during a burst of hits, you feel like a true badass. The way my wife and I played this was that I specialized in melee fighting as the tank, and she was the DPS archer behind my back. I tank, she'd mostly spank. And in that role, being able to block well feels so rewarding. Still, the timings for the different blocks are not always logical, and in some cases, you are expected to block way before the attack would have connected. It takes some time to learn how to respond to the many different attacks of the variety of insects, so you will will be practicing. In addition to that, we mustn't forget that this is an RPG, so upgrading your gear, unlocking and leveling up mutations, which are this gear's talent system, as well as increasing your basic stats by using molars, which you find by exploring the map, is not only extremely satisfying, but also very noticeable. I simply cannot stress how rewarding it felt to face 3 wolf spiders at the same time during the late game and completely demolish them without cheesing, while a single one of those same spiders would have kicked both our asses in a few seconds at the beginning of the game, and actually did. However, payback's a bitch, and those wolf spiders sure learned it the hard way. One of Grounded's weaknesses is that its core loop can become repetitive after extended play. The game's primary progression systems, such as gathering materials to unlock new crafting recipes, exploring new biomes, and fighting tough enemies while engaging at first, can start to feel like a grind. The excitement of discovery and novelty eventually gives way to routine, which may turn off players who are looking for a more narrative-driven experience or complex goals. But let's be honest, most survival games revolve exactly around that, and this is why we have multiple systems at play here. You can run around grinding materials while your wife, who isn't much into combat at first, can stay in the base and build a house during the daytime while getting eaten by wolf spiders at night. Everyone gets to have fun their own way. But jokes aside, I really love the exploration of the various biomes, finding new types of secrets, while she loved building a base. And when she got bored of making the fanciest base possible, or getting eaten by wolf spiders at night, she would join me for an expedition or two. When I got bored exploring, I'd go back to our house and enjoy some base building myself, or also getting eaten by wolf spiders. So it's all about doing different things. There are tons of fun to be had here, you just gotta play it right. So yes, multiplayer is where Grounded truly shines. The game feels designed with co-op in mind, and playing with friends adds a dynamic element to the survival experience. Cooperation is key when tackling the tougher enemies, building more elaborate bases, and managing resources efficiently. There's also a sense of camaraderie when it comes to exploring the backyard as a tiny group of adventurers. Up to 4 people can play together. Communication becomes crucial, and the teamwork needed to survive makes the game much more engaging. Something I cannot praise enough is that the characters are different teenagers with their own attitudes and interests. Add to that the excellent voice acting, their jokes and banter between each other, and it just makes it so much more enjoyable to play and listen to everything. You have everything you need for proper immersion here. On the other hand, the solo experience can feel isolating and, at times, punishing. The balancing between solo and multiplayer isn't perfect. As I've mentioned before, the game's world scales somewhat with the number of players. Many of the bigger enemies and challenges feel disproportionately hard regardless if you are playing alone. Resource gathering also becomes more tedious when you're playing alone, since only one person is going to collect stuff. This makes the game less accessible to players who prefer single-player experience, although it doesn't render it unenjoyable by far. I actually know a bunch of people who play this game exclusively alone, and they're kicking ass and loving it. In many ways, this reflects real life. Most tasks are easier to tackle in a team, but sometimes you need some time alone, and there's nothing wrong with that. Visually, Grounded is striking. With its vibrant and exaggerated backyard setting, the art direction emphasizes color and contrast, making the world feel lively and full of surprises. The use of scale is particularly impressive. There's a real sense of wonder as you navigate under a giant leaf or peer through a dewdrop the size of your head. In terms of frame rate, the game runs really well with the exception of one optional boss fight, which caused some frame drops for no discernible reason. Where things get really annoying are the multiplayer problems for the guest player. For some reason, this game tends to kick the guest player a lot. Normally, it would do it at least once per session, sometimes 3 to 4 times, which a session in our case would be like 3, 4, 5 hours. At one point, I checked an option which shares the save with my wife Sarah, so she can play while I'm at work without having to start my PC and host the game myself. This worked, but while the save was shared, it is constantly synced with the guest, and this seems to cause a lot of crashes. A lot more than usual in any case. It took us a while to figure this out, but during those few hours, the game was practically unplayable since it would kick my wife every 5 to 10 minutes. And that consistently. Once we disabled the save sharing feature, the kicks were reduced to just a few times in the span of multiple hours, which still sucks, but is playable. And now on to something positive again. The sound design is amazing. The ambient noises of the backyard, from the rustling of grass and the ominous sounds of approaching predators, enhance the sense of scale and danger. Music is subtle but effective, rising to dramatic crescendos during combat and exploration, and I loved it, especially because there's somewhat of a synthwave beat to it, and I personally really love that genre. The audio cues, especially for enemies, help create tension and a sense of impending threat, but they can also be useful since many of the enemies will make certain sounds before striking at you with certain attacks, so if you fight them long enough, you're gonna start to learn these and be able to perfect block them even more efficiently just by ear. In fact, there were some enemies where I could, and I actually tested this, close my eyes and just listen to them and perfect block their attacks. Adding to the game's survival atmosphere, this just makes everything better. Oh, and did I mention the excellent voice acting, especially when the characters interact between each other? Yep, it's all there, and I loved it. One area where Grounded falls a bit short is its story and narrative depth. While the game does offer a loose narrative about the mysterious shrinking of the characters and a quest to return to normal size, the story often feels underdeveloped. There are hints of a larger mystery, laboratories hidden throughout the yard, cryptic messages, and hints about a bigger corporate conspiracy, but the plot remains more of a background feature than a driving force. For players who crave strong storytelling in their games, Grounded might feel a bit hollow, as the focus is heavily skewed towards survival and exploration rather than a compelling narrative. But still, as survival games go, I'd say this game's story is still among the best ones out there. I know the bar is still very low, but we are slowly getting there. And I, for one, am excited to see the genre improve even more in the near future. And speaking of the survival genre, Grounded sadly suffers from the common survival game sickness of not explaining anything properly. As is tradition with these games, you will have to watch lots of YouTube videos or read wikis online if you wish to progress properly and really find enjoyment in the game. We actually always try to play these games without external help, and we did this for about 10 hours here. Things were just too slow for our taste. In addition to the fact that the player won't know what to do in many cases, Grounded will also lie to you when it comes to the information it actually gives you. Let me give you some examples. There's a mutation called Parrymaster. The description says, your impeccable timing gives you an extreme advantage when blocking attacks. Every normal person would understand that this means that the window of opportunity for parrying is increased if you use this mutation, making it easier to perform the move. A great example of this would be Dark Souls, where there are items with similar descriptions and exactly that effect. Well, Grounded doesn't mean that. The extreme advantage here is just a small refund of some stamina. This is in fact so confusing that I've seen a lot of threads on the internet that assume exactly the same, and I've also watched some tutorials online in the form of videos which say that it does this, and later on was confirmed that it does not. Another great example would be the stats of the weapons. A normal player would look at the damage stat and the speed stat to determine the damage per second and decide which weapon will be the best choice for him. What you don't know, and it's because the game never really tells you, is that the different weapons have different swing animations, and those are not consistent with what the speed stat claims. This means that some weapons will have higher damage and speed than others, but will end up doing less damage per second than the other weapon, which has lower stats in terms of speed and damage. So the weapon with the lower stats, the weapon that says should be slower and should do less damage, will actually do more damage because it generally has faster animations. The differences can be quite substantial too. Luckily, again, we have the internet to tell us which weapons are good, so you would have to check that too. I didn't know that, but I was watching some things I wish I knew when I started playing, and then people explained these things in these videos, and that's how I knew in advance. But imagine if I didn't know and upgraded some weapon that I thought was good, only to learn that actually the supposedly other weapon that doesn't look as good as it would have been the better choice. So now I have to upgrade that one, and trust me, upgrading requires a lot of materials, some of which can be very rare and difficult to find. And you have to consider these are just some examples with weapons and with mutations, but there are also buffs, item descriptions, set effects, which are just cryptic and will require you to use Google yet again. It will just say something weird that makes no sense to you and doesn't explain anything at all, such as what stat it really boosts or what effect it really has. Like if you play a song occasionally which lifts your spirit, well, what does that mean? What does lifting my spirit do exactly? These kinds of things really annoy me, as you can probably tell, and I cannot understand why the devs didn't do it differently. Why is it so hard to just say what it does and say it properly? But then again, I'm also the kind of guy who can't understand why From Software can't just tell the stories of their games normally as well. So it could just be me. I don't know. Tell me in the comments if you agree or disagree. Anyway, the point is, Grounded is a survival game through and through, and it still suffers from most of the ailments that its predecessors come with. The people like us who love the genre and have played so many such games are well aware of these shortcomings and very prepared for it. But I fear that it does make the cost of entry for new players who are completely new to the genre way too high, which is bad because I would like to see more games with such excellent quality released, and this will be determined by sales figures, and the sales figures will only be determined by how many people want to play this, and if you scare away the new players, you restrict your player base. It's not a good strategy. For fans of survival games and cooperative multiplayer experiences, Grounded offers plenty of enjoyment, especially in its early hours. Then there's inevitably the point where you will have to grind a little bit. You have certain weapons and armors, you figured things out, but you want to upgrade them. You know where you have to go, you know what bugs to kill, what materials to gather, so you will have to do it a bit before you get strong enough to tackle the bosses and all the end game content. So that would be the span a little bit in the center where it gets boring, and then once you get overpowered, once you're thriving and kicking ass and taking names, that's where the game's most fun, at least for me. The hunted have become the hunters, and it's now your turn to dish out the punishment to everyone who's wronged you. Grounded stands out in the crowded survival genre with its inventive premise, vibrant world, and cooperative gameplay that is just fantastic. The joy of exploring a backyard from the perspective of a tiny human is fresh and engaging, and the game succeeds in creating a tense and dangerous atmosphere. I know I've mentioned this before, but it really is the key here. However, there is a bit of repetitiveness, there is some uneven balance between solo and multiplayer, and there's a somewhat lackluster narrative holding it back from being a truly outstanding or maybe even best game in this genre. Still, it is excellent in pretty much every other way, and in addition to that, the game's world is captivating, the gameplay is generally solid, and again, the co-op experience is a lot of fun. If you can see past the potential crashes of your guest from time to time, then Grounded is definitely a must-play survival game for anyone who wants to play it with friends, spouses, girlfriends, whatever. I can wholeheartedly recommend it. And if you want to play it solo, go ahead as well. It's totally doable. You can still kill all the bosses, including the optional ones. You can really get super overpowered on your own as well. Just things might be a bit slower. But what's the hurry anyway, right? So at the end of the day, if you are a fan of survival games, like my wife and I are, then you will love Grounded. I loved it, she loved it. Everyone I know who loves these types of games absolutely loves Grounded. I can wholeheartedly recommend it. With that having been said, I want to thank you for watching Game Filter. I hope this review has been informative, and want to remind you to check out my other reviews of survival games such as Conan Exiles, The Forest, Subnautica, etc. Oh yeah, Hobo Tough Life is a pretty good one as well. Just go and watch them all. They're all good videos of mostly really good games. Thanks again for watching. This is Nino signing out.